We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. Hi Liz, hi comrades, welcome back to our 101 series. So before we get into things, Liz, we've had our first request.
Ooh.
From user Captain Individual and then some numbers on Reddit. So thank you for getting in touch. You asked for some work on Jackson's representationalism and Frankish's illusionism. I think we'll possibly bring in Frankish later in the 101 series, but Jackson's more Liz's area, so when Liz has some time to do a scriptural leader discussion on Jackson for us.
Yep, I found some very old notes from very long ago on that paper, so...
Cool.
I will update them.
They're there. Half the work's done already. So if anyone else has any requests, if they'd like to test our credentials to see how well we know the things that you care about, feel free to send them in and we'll try and fit those in somewhere between the 101 and the new papers series. Today we'll be talking about and introducing something that you will have heard us talk about on the main series, namely quality spaces. So, Liz, this one was hard.
Good. It's not just me.
No, not just in that the texts I read to try and narrow down our focus were badly done. Not that they were badly done, just that there's so much to this idea that it's difficult to know exactly where to start. Do we start with the experimental procedures themselves, or the maths underlying the geometry of the spaces?
Not the maths.
Not the maths.
I hope that's not what you've done.
That is, in fact, is not what I've done. Because if we start with those, it's too easy to lose sight of exactly what quality spaces are supposed to say about consciousness. It's easy to lose the big picture. This is something that Clarke himself says at the start of his second most famous book, A Theory of Sentience, in which he uses his previous work on quality spaces to develop an account of, sentience. What I've chosen for us to look at is the first chapter of A Theory of Sentience, and not something taken from Sensory Qualities, even though that book is, and by a wide margin, the most important book on consciousness to date. Like if someone were to read one book on consciousness in their life, it should definitely be that one. But the upside of this choice is that we can focus on quality spaces as a description of consciousness without getting lost in the maths or the experimental design. The downside is that some of the arguments for the implications Clarke thinks quality spaces have will be glossed over because those arguments appear in the earlier work. But we'll come back to them when we consider the broader theory of consciousness Clarke is offering. It's also not easy to see, although I've worked in some examples, for how this relates to our last 101 episode on heterophenomenology. To really get our heads around that connection, we'll need to look at how quality spaces are measured, which we'll get to. But I thought that we should start by explaining what quality spaces are. Does that sound all right, Liz?
That sounds good.
So let's go. Chapter 1 of A Theory of Sentience, Quality Spaces. So Liz, what's a quality space? You do all my work for me.
Quality space is a way of representing the relations between different experiences.
So it's a way of describing the quality of experiences in terms of their relative similarity. So it's not any relation between the experience, it's really relative similarity is the one that they pick out. Like we talked about in the main series lists, lots of kids produce rudimentary quality spaces for fun by ordering coloured pencils or textures or what have you. As this is the 101 episode, it's worth reminding ourselves of this. If you've got a box of pencils or some of those fun clicky together textures, you can grab them now and do this along with us. So start with the purple one. So that's the cool one. Purple's a bit red, So pop the red one next to it, which is a bit orange. So cool, we'll pop the red and the orange next to each other. Yellow's also a bit orange, so that can go next. And then you can get that disgusting yellow-green one, which I hate, the few greens, the aqua one, then the blues, and then we're back at purple. And what we end up with here is an ordering of the pencils in terms of how similar they appear to be along one dimension, the dimension of hue. Now, when we're sorting colours, there are 3 dimensions that we can use, at least for simple colour experiences. So here, Liz, we're talking about what sort of colour experiences?
Of surfaces.
Just thinking about the complexity of the stimuli, so wanting to avoid, colour contrast effects and difficult things so like that.
Not just that it's not light.
Thinking here of like a single colour bit of plastic on a neutral background, always on the same neutral background under the same set of light. When we're thinking about those sorts of stimuli, the first dimension we get is hue. Here we're thinking about what colour is in the colloquial sense, so the shade of something, is it red or turquoise or lavender or whatever. We can also sort colours by how light or dark they are, like pinks or light reds, but we can do that for any hue, going from dark blue to sky blue, for example. We can also sort them by how colourful they are, so this is called saturation, and here we're sorting from greys through pastels to the more saturated colours. When we sort colours according to all 3 of these dimensions, we get a quality space for colours. Each colour being represented by a point in that space with a value on the hue dimension, the brightness dimension, and the saturation dimension. Now, are these 3 dimensions sufficient to describe all colour experiences? So if we start adding in translucent surfaces rather than opaque ones, then we need more dimensions to describe them. Whatever space you end up with for a particular set of experiences that we're trying to describe, it remains true that the more similar colours are closer. So the distance between them represents their relative similarity. To get our head around quality spaces, the first thing we really want to try and clarify is just what are quality spaces describing. So you might have noticed an ambiguity in how I introduced the concept of quality space. I said that quality spaces describe experiences, but then I started listing things that we can experience. That is coloured pencils. We're going to need to get clear on whether quality spaces are describing experiences themselves or if they describe the thing in the world that we experience.
And when we get to our request show on Jackson, this phenomenon of what some philosophers like to call the transparency of experience will become particularly relevant. So when you try and describe your experience, you end up describing the thing you're experiencing. So when I try and describe the brownness of my experience of the dirt, I end up simply describing the brownness of the dirt on the screen.
When we say my experience is a green experience, we mean something different than when we say that a pencil is green, right? So for those of our listeners who have done some work in representation or semiotics, you can think of this as a species of a vehicle-object distinction. In this chapter, Clark discusses a few ways that this distinction can be drawn, and some suggestions from Sellers and others about different labels we can use. His preferred option here is to distinguish between phenomenal and qualitative properties. Now, this is a bit confusing, at least to me, because there are others who use phenomenal properties to mean the same as what Clark means by qualitative properties.
I remember that. That was really freaking confusing.
Yeah. But it's qualitative properties that Clark is aiming to describe with quality spaces, and these are, quote, properties of such internal states in virtue of which things out there appear as they do, end quote. Liz, why does this matter?
Because you've got to make sure you're explaining the right thing.
Yeah. We want our theory of consciousness to be pitched at consciousness and not something else. Also, there isn't an entirely consistent mapping from our experiences to the things that those experiences represent.
Sorry, I'm laughing because this created many headaches for me.
Many headaches for you. But also a
others.
thesis. And others, yeah.
Also a PhD in
Yeah.
the end.
Yeah. So, Liz, I know you sometimes see things as orange, which I see as red.
Yep.
This sort of individual difference is quite common. The example that Clark uses is from an experiment in which people are asked to pick out from different coloured lights a green light that looks green, not at all yellow, and not at all blue. In these sorts of experiments, different people will pick out different things, so slightly different lights. Everyone with normal photoreceptors and no other visual differences can pick out a green that appears to them to be not at all yellow and not at all blue. They all pick out something that looks like that to them, but the thing in the world that they pick out has some variance, so slightly different lights. There is a distinction then between things in the world that are green and our experiences of green. What matters for us today is that quality spaces are aimed at describing our experiences, our consciousness, not the things in the world that we experience or are conscious of.
So even though Glenn and I might choose a different surface as pure red, and I might say the one he chooses is a bit orange, the point is that there is a surface which we will both say is pure red, and what we're interested in is the experience that we attach to those surfaces, not which surface we choose.
Thinking about quality spaces, what reason do we have to think that they describe the qualities of our experiences and not, as you might think from my introduction, coloured pencils or other things in the world? Clark considers first the possibility that quality spaces describe stimuli, so that is the things that we look at, the things in the world. He provides many examples to show that quality spaces don't describe the stimuli as such. Some of this is helpful for understanding the complexity of studying colour and colour experiences, but the key point here is that, quote, relationships between qualities cannot be cashed out directly in stimulus terms, end quote. Essentially, stimuli do not have the same relationships of similarity that experiences do. There isn't a sense in which all surfaces that appear purple are somehow between all surfaces that appear red and those that appear blue. Indeed, you can make the same surface that appears blue in one condition appear purple in another just by changing the ambient lighting. Now, we might be tempted to say from that the relevant stimulus is the light that hits the eye rather than the surface. That's wrong for other reasons, but it also won't help here because there isn't a sense in which all the various kinds of light that produce purple sensations are between those that produce red or blue sensations. Despite that, all experiences of purple are between experiences of red and experiences of blue. As Clark says, quote, this fact is at some remove from relations that we can state in stimulus terms. It does not imply that one packet of photons is between two other packets, end quote. We can still use stimuli to label points in our quality space, but the stimuli themselves are not defining of those points. That's going to be important when we get to Clark's theory of consciousness, so we do want to hold that point in mind. So what does have the appropriate relationships of similarity, if not the stimuli?
The experiences.
Yep.
Didn't I just say that?
So, for Clark, these are the properties of appearance. So that is how stimuli look or sound or taste, etc., whatever you're interested in. Here we're still talking about the properties of the thing in the world, but we just said that stimuli don't themselves have the structure of a quality space in themselves. So where does that structure come from? It's a bit convoluted, I know. The structure is a structure of qualitative properties, i.e. a structure of experiences themselves, not the things experienced. So, yeah, Liz, what you just said. Okay. Now, there's more here, but it will derail our main interest, which is the use of quality spaces to describe experiences. But some of those convolutions we will come back to when we're considering the theoretical aspect of Clarke's work. Where we're up to is just the proposal that we can use a space to describe experiences, where the points in space represent experiences, the dimensions, the ways in which experiences can be distinguished, and the distances' relative similarity. That we can use distances in these spaces to represent relative similarity is how we get a representation of the structure of the qualities of consciousness. By saying structure here, it means something a bit different than what you would get in Husserlian phenomenology or other approaches like that. Here we're just talking about the relationships between experiences. A paradigmatic structural claim is the claim that purple experiences are between red and blue experiences. Now, we use the term qualitative similarities to describe these sorts of relations. For Clarke, a structure described exhaustively in terms of qualitative similarities is sufficient to define any conscious quality. Now, it's going to be the basis of the theory later on, so do keep it in mind. But for now, we don't have to follow Clarke all the way to that claim, at the claim that this is all you need to define a conscious quality, to see that these give us a very good description of experience, or at least give us something that needs to be explained. Why do I think that? First up, structural descriptions of conscious qualities, that is, quality spaces, generalize across subjects even when the mappings of the structures to stimuli do not. We know that individuals don't always have the same mappings, so this is what we were talking about before, Liz, when we noted that sometimes you see things as orange that I see as red. This sort of difference is empirically robust. We talked about the green light experiments before. Do this with color chips or light. You ask someone to pick out a green that's not at all yellow, not at all blue. Different individuals pick out different stimuli, like we talked about earlier. Despite that difference in the mapping of experiences onto stimuli, there is an identifiable structure and relations of people's color judgments that do generalize. One way to see this is in complementary colors. So, Liz, what are complementary colors?
They're opposites. We'll say that there can't be a red that has any... So you can have a red that has some blue in it, or a red that has some yellow in it, but you can't have a red that has some green in it, despite what people might say about brown. Here it's important to distinguish between mixing colours and what they look like. So here we've got lots of brown cows at the moment. Now, many of you who have mixed paint in the past will know that you can make a brown colour by mixing red and green. But if you look at the brown, it doesn't look like a mixture of red and green. It looks reddish, but it doesn't look at all greenish, as opposed to these ones, which are a bit pink and a tiny bit blue, the mauve ones.
Cool. So mixing paints is one way to get different colours. What happens if you try and mix complementary lights?
They look white.
In these experiments, we use coloured lights and we get people to pick out a unitary green, so a green that's not at all yellow, not at all blue, and a unitary red. Again, that's a red that's not at all yellow and not at all blue. As we were talking about before, people will pick out slightly different stimuli here, so slightly different lights. Yeah, for every subject who doesn't have a visual difference, like lacking a kind of cone, their unitary green is cancelled by their unitary red. So when you mix the green that they chose with the red that they chose, they'll see something that to them looks achromatic, so a greyish, whitish light. But Liz, what happens if you give someone else's unitary lights?
They may not cancel out.
Yeah.
They probably won't, is the odds.
Yeah. You end up with something that looks a bit like a faded yellow or a faded blue. But it is true that for everyone who doesn't have like a difference in their cones, you can find unitary coloured lights that do cancel. So this is evidence for Clark that the structure in terms of the relationships of similarity between experiences is preserved between people, even if the exact mapping of that structure onto the world varies. So that's one example, but the point is just that we have reason to think that the structure of similarity between colour experiences is consistent between people, even when we know they're not having exactly the same colour experience of something in the world. For Clark, once we have a quality space describing a particular domain of qualities like colours, we don't need to reach outside of that space to describe any quality within it. So you can have a region like orange or a particular point corresponding to a unique green. These sorts of things are all defined entirely in terms of their location in the space and thereby in terms of their distances to other points or regions. This will lead to the more controversial parts of Clark's theory, namely the claim that qualities of consciousness are described in their entirety by their relations of similarity. That is, quote, the facts in virtue of which that experience is an experience of orange and not of some other quality are all relational facts, end quote. We'll start going through theories of consciousness soon, so we will be returning to that. But before we get to it, I want to think about the experiment that suggested that the similarity structures of colour experiences are the same for different people, even when they don't map onto exactly the same stimuli. Thinking about this in relation to things we've already talked about in 101, is this an example of heterophenomenology as defined by Dennett? What do you think, Liz?
Yeah. Isn't it?
It's not completely different, as you say there, Liz. So if we remember this quote from Dennett from last time, which is just, quote, experiments in which human subjects collaborate with experimenters, making suggestions, interacting verbally, telling what it is like, end quote. That was Dennett's first suggestion about how to do heterophenomenology, and that seems to cover a fair bit of what's going on in the complementary colours experiment. But do recall that there is more to heterophenomenology than this. It also works from the assumption that what we can infer from this are subjects' beliefs about what they experience, not the experiences themselves, at least in the first instance. So in the complementary colours task, we should infer that subjects believe the lights they choose are a green that's not at all yellow or not at all blue, and the same for the red, that they believe the light for their own complementary colours is achromatic, and that for someone else's it's very slightly yellow or slightly blue. But we should remain neutral as to whether or not these beliefs are accurate descriptions of their experiences. So this is a difference, because Clark doesn't seem to be taking this neutrality. He seems to be taking it the subject's reports and matching behaviours give us the structure of the colour experiences themselves, not just their beliefs about them. I think here it's a matter of the empirical sophistication rather than the theoretical work. It's just that the work that's gone on with colour spaces and complementary colours, that sort of thing, is just a bit further along than the work that Dennett's pitching the heterophenomenology at, which was more of things like binocular rivalry and mass priming and so on. It's not to say that those aren't empirically mature fields, but in those, the description of experience is less detailed than you get from this sort of matching work.
You're just saying, in, say, binocular rivalry, it's a house. No, it's a boat.
Yeah.
As opposed to, oh, that shade of green is more like... Shade of green 1 is more like shade of green 2 than shade of green 3.
Yeah, so you can't get any sort of structural claims from that sort of work. And I wanted to talk about this because I think that without this neutrality, Clarke's offering a different revision to our concept of consciousness than Dennett did. And we can see this in Clarke's response to Nagel. It's been a few weeks since we talked about Nagel, but the problem for Nagel was that a bat's point of view on the world is so different from our point of view that it is impossible for us to understand things from the bat's point of view. Clarke offers an explicit response to that here in this chapter. His response depends on a particular conceptualization of the problem. This is fine. How we think about problems should change as our theories change. And remember that Nagel is working with a pre-theoretical concept of consciousness and Clarke is not. So if Nagel's concerns survive the introduction of quality spaces at all, it will be in a different form than originally stated. This is also helpful for us because it's possible from this to see the form of the conceptual revision that Nagel asked for at the end of his paper. So if you think that quality spaces, so describing experiences in terms of their relative similarity, is the right way to go, we can put the problem that Nagel raised like this. Quote, this is from Clarke: "The bat has an alien structure of qualitative similarities of what resembles what," end quote. For example, in locations of a fluttering moth that we as humans couldn't tell apart would appear different to a bat. So put another way, quote, "The bat has an alien structure of qualitative similarities of what resembles what," end quote. If quality spaces are the right description of consciousness, then the concern about alien points of view becomes a concern of how we can understand these radically different structures of qualitative similarity. So, quote, "We cannot imagine what it is like for the bat in the sense that our paradigms and our sense of qualitative similarity cannot get us to the point where for us, like the bat, X and Y are qualitatively similar, that being two locations of a fluttering moth, for example, we would need to acquire the bat's quality space," end quote. Here we're getting a revision of the whole concept of a point of view. Again, quote, "To experience things from the bat's point of view is to experience the resemblances that the bat experiences to have its quality space," end quote. So there is, for Clarke, this incommensurability of points of view. If there were bats that, in addition to having these very different quality spaces, also had a human-like language that we could learn, we could, of course, have labels for their sonar experiences, but we couldn't, quote, "learn successfully to apply the word in a direct first-person fashion," end quote, because there is nothing going on in us for those words to refer to. There is a sense then in which Clarke agrees with Nagel. There is a sense in which bad experiences are inaccessible to us. But there is a disagreement here as well, because there is a sense in which the bat's experiences can be accessed by us. We'd have to do the experiments to map out a quality space for the bats. Of course, that's easier with our sci-fi linguistic bats, but as long as we can measure what bats can and can't discriminate, it's possible to get a map of their quality spaces. There is a sense here in which, quote, "the subject matter of sensory resemblance is not one that is accessible only from one point of view," end quote. Now, to evaluate whether or not this is a good move, we'll need to get beyond quality spaces as a description of experiences and to see them as a theory of consciousness. But to start with, we can see how describing experiences in this way is already revising our concepts of experience and point of view. So far in our 101 episodes, we've had a look at what the problem of consciousness is and a couple of proposals as to how to measure and describe it. Both of those have started the project of revising our pre-theoretical concept of consciousness to something that's going to be useful for theories. And we've tried to make our understanding answerable to reality. Next time out, we'll have a look at some more conceptual revisions to our concept of consciousness as proposed by Bloch. But before that, we'll have a main series episode on what's represented by experiences of smell.
Cool.
So, with that, let's call it a day. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, everyone. See, so folks, this is why I normally just go and fish or something, because as soon as I try and do something like create arrows, I get distracted by the fact that I put my, whatchamacallit, crafting table somehow in midair. And then I don't actually pay attention to what Glenn's saying. Never claimed to be good at Minecraft. Those of you who are will be groaning.
Yeah. No one watches the video to learn how to play Minecraft. At least we desperately hope so. Not.
Cows and chickens eat the same thing, don't they?
No, cows eat wheat and chickens eat seed.